There is a question that has ended friendships, split congregations, and driven honest people away from faith entirely. It is 4 words long. Did God command genocide? Most people never look directly at it. They soften it, skip past it, or quietly decide to believe in a God with the difficult pages removed. That is the comfortable answer. This is not that video. Over the next 35 minutes, we are going to walk into the fire of the oldest theological scandal in history. We are going to sit with the smoke and the silence and the questions that don't resolve cleanly. We are going to meet a God who is far more dangerous than the Sunday school version, and far more loving than the critics will admit. By the end, you won't have a neat answer. You will have something better. You will have the truth. Stay with me. This story will cost you something, and it will be worth every moment. Imagine you are handed a book. No title, no context. You open it somewhere in the middle, and you read, "Do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them." You close the book, your hands are trembling slightly, and then someone tells you that this book is the word of a God who is love. That is where we begin. Every generation produces its skeptics, its priests, and its quiet doubters who sit in the third pew from the back, smiling at the right moments, but carrying a question they've never said out loud. The question isn't really about history. It isn't really about archaeology. It's a question about the character of God. And if we're going to answer it honestly, we have to be willing to sit in the fire of it rather than fan it away with comfortable theology. The Hebrew word is herem. It means devoted, set apart, consecrated to God by being consumed. In a Bronze Age world, it was the highest form of sacred action. An entire city, its people, its livestock, its gold, surrendered entirely to the divine. Not taken, not enslaved, destroyed. The word smells like smoke. It sounds like silence after screaming stops, and it stands at the center of one of the most disturbing questions in all of religious history. If God is love, why does the text smell like smoke and iron? In the 2nd century of the Common Era, a wealthy shipowner from the Black Sea coast named Marcion decided he had the answer. His solution was elegant in its brutality. Simply cut. Remove the problem. Take your scissors to Genesis, to Exodus, to all the law and the prophets, and produce a cleaner, kinder, more palatable faith. Marcion's Bible was the first redacted scripture in history, a document purged of its darkness, leaving only what he deemed the light. The church called it heresy, not because they were afraid of the question, but because they understood the catastrophic logic of Marcion's answer. The God who flooded the earth is the same God who became an infant in a feeding trough. You cannot surgically separate them without destroying both. The New Testament does not replace the Old Testament judge. It reveals what that judge was always moving toward. The psychological comfort of Marcion's position is obvious. We want a God who is only warm, only gentle, a God who holds children and forgives debts and never, under any circumstances, commands an army to march. But here is the chilling theological reality that Marcion missed. You cannot remove the judge without also killing the Savior. Because without justice, sacrifice is merely theater. Can you remove the judge without accidentally killing the Savior? The answer has never changed. No. Let us look at the numbers, because numbers have a way of cutting through sentiment. The book of Joshua mentions dozens of cities conquered, thousands of inhabitants destroyed. Read plainly, without any framework. The casualty estimates of the Canaanite campaign would rank among the most comprehensive acts of annihilation in the ancient Near East. The arithmetic is staggering. But here is what the modern reader almost never learns. Every great ruler of the Bronze Age, every pharaoh, every Hittite king, every Assyrian warlord described his military victories in the same language. Total destruction, complete annihilation. Not one enemy left breathing. It was the expected rhetoric of conquest. Archaeologists call it warfare hyperbole, and it appears in Egyptian temple inscriptions, Mesopotamian clay tablets, and Ugaritic poetry with the same predictable regularity. When Pharaoh Thutmose III described his campaigns in Canaan, he didn't write nuance. He wrote total victory. When the Mesha Stele records a Moabite king's campaign, the language is nearly identical to Joshua. This does not mean nothing happened. It means we must read the text the way its original audience would have, within the literary conventions of its age. Is the text describing a literal genocide or a ritualized eviction? The answer may surprise you, and it matters more than you think. Before any sword was drawn, there were 40 years of sand, 40 years of a people unlearning everything. The generation that built the pyramids, brick makers, water carriers, men who knew how to survive by not being seen, had to die before the generation that would take the land could be born. The wilderness was not a detour, it was a classroom. The manna fell every morning. You could not store it, you could not market it, you could not build a surplus and feel secure. Every day the provision came, and every day the faith had to be renewed. It was a diet engineered to produce total dependence. And after 40 years of absolute dependence on God for survival, God handed them weapons. Think carefully about what that means. A slave population, conditioned by generations of oppression, suddenly holding swords. Their hands were more familiar with clay than iron. Their instinct was not aggression, it was endurance. And the God who fed them on miracle bread and quenched their thirst from desert rock looked at those rough hands and said, "Now go." What happens to the soul of a slave when God hands them a sword? That question has never fully been answered. Just outside the walls of Jericho, Joshua met a figure standing in the road with a drawn sword. A soldier's instinct, reasonable and necessary, kicked in. Joshua demanded an answer. Are you for us or for our enemies? The answer was not the one he expected. Neither, the figure said. I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now remove your sandals, for the ground where you stand is holy. Theologians have debated this encounter for centuries. Most conclude this was a Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, the eternal Son, stepping into history before Bethlehem. And his answer to Joshua's very human, very understandable question is perhaps the most theologically dangerous statement in the entire book. God is not a banner to march under. He is not a mascot for nationalism, ancient or modern. He does not choose sides. He has a side. And the question is always whether we are standing on it. If God isn't on our side, whose war is this? The fires began. The first city fell, and with it, the dream of a bloodless promised land. There is a scent memory that ancient texts almost never capture, but that soldiers throughout history have described in nearly identical terms. The smell of a burning city mingles wood smoke, stone dust, and something iron sweet in the air. That was the smell of the conquest's opening chapter. And yet, somewhere in that smoke, a theologian must hold what scholars call the scandal of the particular. God did not choose a great people. He chose a small, stiff-necked, frequently faithless group of former slaves, and through that specific people, he chose to execute a specific decree in a specific geography at a specific moment in history. This is offensive to the modern sensibility, which prefers universal solutions and clean, impartial justice. But particularity is the nature of surgery. A scalpel does not operate on everything at once. Is the land being given to Israel, or is Israel being used as a surgical instrument? By the time this documentary is finished, you will understand that the answer is both, and that understanding will cost you something. Before there was a single soldier on the road to Canaan, before the first trumpet was lifted toward the walls of Jericho, there was a conversation between God and an old man under a sky full of stars. Abraham stood in the dark, and God made a promise. The land would belong to his descendants, but then came the clause that theologians have quietly wrestled with for millennia. Your descendants will return here, God said, but not yet. Because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure, 400 years would pass. 4 centuries of Egypt, of slavery, of brick and mortar, and the slow grinding of a people into the dust. And during all of that time, God was watching Canaan, waiting, measuring something invisible but precise, the accumulating weight of a civilization's choices. This is the first thing you must understand about the God of the conquest. He is not impulsive. He is not easily provoked. The judgment that seems sudden to us was, in the divine accounting, the final page of a very long and patient document. The fuse was 400 years long, and it was God who held the match, and God who refused to strike it until the last possible moment. What was happening in Canaan while Israel suffered in Egypt? The answer is not comfortable, but it is necessary. Archaeology is a patient discipline. It brushes sand away in millimeters, not miles. And what it has uncovered in the ruins of Canaanite civilization is not the picture of a merely different culture with alternative values. In the ancient city of Carthage, a cultural descendant of Canaan, excavators discovered a Tophet, a sacred precinct filled with the cremated remains of thousands of infants and small children, urns stacked in rows, each one representing a transaction between a parent and a god. The practice has been debated, but the evidence is now overwhelming. In Canaan, Moloch was not a fringe deity. He was civic religion. The drums that beat during the sacrifices were not incidental. Ancient sources are explicit that their function was to drown out the screaming. This was not a private sin committed in secret and then regretted. This was the sound of a culture's worship. The altars of Baal were not hidden in back alleys. They stood in the high places, visible from every road, and the practices performed there, what the biblical text calls sacred prostitution, were not moral aberrations within the culture. They were the culture's sacraments. When God looked at Canaan, he was not looking at a people who had simply chosen different traditions. He was looking at a civilization that had institutionalized the destruction of the most vulnerable human beings it produced. At what point does a culture become a cancer that requires a scalpel? Canaan had been answering that question for 400 years, and finally, the answer arrived. The Hebrew language is precise in ways that English translation frequently obscures. There are 2 different words for the taking of a human life, and the commandment at Sinai uses only one of them. Lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. Not harag, the word for killing in battle or in judgment. Ratzach, unlawful, premeditated personal killing driven by hatred or greed. The commandment that Western culture cites most frequently when questioning the conquest is, in its original language, not violated by the conquest. This is the linguistic wall that changes everything once you see it. The Israelite camp was a moving temple. The laws of ritual purity that governed it were not arbitrary religious fastidiousness. They were the architecture of a people designed to be a dwelling place for the holy. And within that framework, the concept of tueva, abomination, referred specifically to actions that invert the natural order of creation, things that unmake rather than make, things that take the structure God built into the fabric of existence and deliberately reverse it. The conquest, in the language of the Torah, was not murder. It was the removal of an inversion. Whether that answer satisfies you may depend on something deeper than theology. Was the conquest a holy war or a cosmic cleaning? The text insists it was both, and it dares you to argue with the distinction. Her name was Rahab. She lived in the wall of Jericho itself, her house built into the city's defenses, and she was, by profession, a prostitute in a culture where that profession had religious dimensions we should not sanitize. She was, by every metric the conquest was designed to judge, on the wrong side of the line. And yet, when the two spies came to her door, she made a choice. She had heard about the God of Israel, the parting of the Red Sea, the defeat of the Amorite kings. She confessed that the knowledge had been in Jericho for 40 years, that hearts had melted and courage had fled. And then she did the thing that the entire city of Jericho had refused to do. She aligned herself with the God she feared. The scarlet cord she hung in her window is one of the most quietly devastating images in Scripture. The Passover blood on the doorposts of Egypt, the blood of the covenant, and now a red thread in a harlot's window, pulling her whole household out of the path of judgment. Rahab's name appears centuries later in the genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth. The conquest was not ethnic cleansing. The proof is in that genealogy. If one woman could change her fate, why didn't the others? That question deserves more than a simple answer. The spies who came to Rahab were not heroes. The text portrays them as men who needed a Canaanite woman to hide them under stalks of flax on her roof while their enemies searched below. Compare their trembling to the calm of the woman who negotiated their escape with precision and theological clarity. The clean representatives of Israel, the officially commissioned scouts, were outclassed in faith by the woman they were supposed to be surveilling. This is not an accident in the text. It is a pattern. The Canaanites had watched the God of Israel move through history for 40 years. The plagues of Egypt were known. The crossing of the sea was known. The defeat of Sihon and Og was known. The information was available. The choice to persist in Baal worship was not born of ignorance. The book of Joshua is careful to let this sit without comfortable resolution. Hardness of heart is never purely a divine imposition. It is also a daily decision made 10,000 times until the capacity to decide differently has quietly atrophied. Jericho was not a primitive village. Archaeologists place it among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on Earth, and at the time of Israel's approach, it was a fortified shrine city, its walls not merely military but theological, dedicated to the lunar deity and reinforced by the conviction that the gods of the high places were unassailable. The 7 days of silent marching that preceded the wall's collapse were not military strategy in any conventional sense. They were theater. 7 days of a patient, silent God demonstrating to both armies that what was about to happen required no siege engines, no battering rams, no human ingenuity, only the sound of the shofar and the coordinated shout of a people who had learned in 40 years of eating miracle bread that God provides what he promises. When the walls fell inward, and archaeology at the site of Tel es-Sultan preserves compelling evidence of collapsed mud brick walls, it was not a military victory, it was a verdict. When the walls fall, who is truly being judged? The people or their gods? At Jericho, the answer thundered from the rubble. The gods of the walls had been weighed, and they were found to be nothing at all. No one writes songs about what happens the morning after a battle. The victory hymns, the processional psalms, the triumphant narratives, they capture the moment the wall falls, the moment the enemy flees. But there is another moment, quieter and far less documented, that every soldier who has ever carried a weapon knows intimately. It is the moment the noise stops. When the dust begins to settle, and the hands that held the sword have nothing left to do, and the mind, finally unguarded, begins to process what those hands have done. The Torah was unusual in the ancient world for acknowledging this moment at all. Numbers chapter 31 contains a command that military historians find remarkable in its context. Soldiers returning from battle were required to remain outside the camp for 7 days. They had to purify themselves, not because they had sinned in a legal sense. The text is clear that the battle was commanded, but because the taking of human life, even under divine directive, leaves a residue on the soul that the law took seriously enough to require a formal period of transition. Modern psychology has a name for what happens when a person is required to act in ways that violate their deepest moral instincts, even in service of a cause they believe is just. It is called moral injury, and the God who commanded the conquest apparently understood it 3,000 years before the clinical literature caught up. Does God care about the trauma of those he commands to strike? The Torah answers quietly, but unmistakably, yes. The victory at Jericho was total. The city fell, Rahab and her household were preserved, and Israel crossed a threshold from a wandering people into a people with a foothold in history. Then they turned toward a small, unremarkable hill town called Ai, and they were routed. 36 men died, and the rest fled in panic down the mountain passes. Joshua tore his clothes and fell on his face before the ark, and God's answer was not comfort. Get up, Israel has sinned. Not a soldier at the front, not a general who gave a wrong order. Israel had sinned. One man, a man named Achan from the tribe of Judah, had seen a beautiful Babylonian robe, 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold buried in the ruins of Jericho. He wanted them. He took them. He buried them under his tent. And 36 men who had nothing to do with his decision died because of it. The Valley of Achor, which means the Valley of Trouble, is where Achan and his household were brought and judged. It is one of the most uncomfortable passages in all of Scripture for the modern individualistic mind. We have built entire civilizations on the premise that a person is responsible only for their own choices. The story of Achan dismantles that premise without apology. In an individualistic age, can we even comprehend a God who sees us as one body? The question is not rhetorical. It is the question on which entire theologies either stand or collapse. We are not as far from Canaan as we prefer to believe. The 21st century has its own accounting systems, its own carefully maintained blindnesses, its own drums beating loud enough to drown out certain screams. We produce statistics about preventable deaths, from poverty, from pollution, from the structural failures of systems we benefit from, and we file those statistics in reports. And the reports are discussed in conferences, and the conferences produce frameworks, and the frameworks produce more statistics. The machinery of modern civilization generates its casualties with the same regularity as any Bronze Age empire. It simply does so at a remove that allows us to keep eating. The iniquity of the Amorites did not reach its full measure in a single dramatic moment. It accumulated in small decisions made by ordinary people who found the alternatives inconvenient. The gap between a culture that burns infants on an altar and a culture that accepts the quiet, statistical death of children as a byproduct of economic arrangements is not as wide as the language we use to describe them would suggest. One is visceral and undeniable. The other is abstracted into policy language. Both require the same capacity for selective not seeing. Are we the Israelites or are we the Canaanites of the 21st century? Sit with that question long enough, and the courtroom from our opening chapter begins to look different. The defendant's chair is closer to the gallery than we thought. Every time Israel failed to complete the mandate, the pattern was consistent and devastating. They would spare a high place here, leave a cultic altar standing there, allow intermarriage with a family still practicing the old rites. The book of Judges, which begins just after Joshua ends, reads like a clinical case study in what happens when leaven is permitted to remain in the batch. The cycle is merciless in its regularity. Compromise, assimilation, the adoption of Canaanite practice, and finally, the sacrifice of Israelite children in the same fires that the conquest was designed to extinguish. The biological metaphor that the Torah employs is not accidental. Fermentation is not aggressive in the way a military invasion is aggressive. It is patient. It works at the molecular level, changing the nature of the host material from the inside, gradually and irreversibly. By the time the change is visible, it has usually already become structural. The generation that entered Canaan understood the stakes. Their children, growing up surrounded by the remnants of the culture they had not fully displaced, experienced those remnants as familiar. And familiar is the most dangerous word in the vocabulary of spiritual compromise. Is tolerance a virtue when the thing being tolerated is lethal? The answer the text gives is consistent across 5 books of Moses and the entire historical narrative that follows. Tolerance, in this specific context, was not compassion. It was the slow-motion version of the thing it was designed to prevent. The Gibeonites arrived in Joshua's camp wearing worn-out sandals and carrying moldy bread and cracked wineskins. Their story was elaborate and specific. They had come from a very distant land, drawn by the fame of Israel's God, and they wanted a peace treaty. Joshua looked at the evidence, the stale provisions, the exhausted travelers, and made his decision. He signed the covenant. 3 days later, the truth emerged. The Gibeonites lived 4 miles away. They were among the people groups the mandate had specifically named. The deception was total, and the leadership of Israel had fallen for it because they had neglected the one thing that the entire wilderness experience had been designed to build into them as a reflex. They had not consulted God. The Urim and Thummim, the sacred lots by which the divine will was sought, went unused. The decision was made on the basis of visible evidence and human reasoning. It was a reasonable decision by ordinary standards. It was catastrophic by the standards of a people whose entire identity was built on the premise that God sees what human eyes cannot. And then the story takes its most theologically striking turn. God honored the treaty, even though it was extracted by fraud, even though it violated the mandate. The sworn covenant made in his name was binding. Centuries later, when a king named Saul violated the protection Israel had promised the Gibeonites, God held the nation accountable for it. Does God value his integrity more than his perfect plan? At Gibeon, the answer written in dust and dried bread is unmistakable. A vow made in the name of God carries a weight that even deception cannot fully cancel. Job asked his questions from the ash heap, and God answered him from a whirlwind, not with an explanation, not with a philosophical treatise that addressed each of Job's carefully constructed arguments. God answered with questions of his own. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? The answer to Job was not information, it was perspective. And it is the same answer that stands behind the entire architecture of the conquest narrative. We arrive at the text with our modern categories, human rights, proportionality, the laws of war, and we demand that God submit his decisions to our tribunal. We want an explanation we can evaluate. We want God to justify himself on terms we have set. The potter and the clay argument in Romans 9 is not a counsel of despair or an invitation to moral passivity. It is a reminder of the radical asymmetry between a finite mind operating within time and the intelligence that designed time itself. The demand for an explanation is legitimate. It is human. It is even, in some sense, honoring to the relationship between a child and a father. But underneath it, if we are honest, is something else. The demand that God be our peer. The insistence that if he cannot explain himself in our language, to our satisfaction, within the constraints of our comprehension, then his decisions are invalid. Is our demand for an explanation actually a demand that God becomes small enough for us to manage? The book of Job suggests that the moment God becomes that small, he is no longer God, and we are no longer safe. The conquest was never supposed to be the final word. Read the full sweep of the biblical narrative, and a different picture emerges, one that the violence of Joshua can obscure if you stop reading too soon. because threading through the entire story, like a quiet river running beneath the louder noise of war, is the movement of unexpected people toward the light. The mixed multitude that left Egypt with Israel was not a footnote. They were a theological statement embedded in the Exodus narrative itself. Non-Hebrews, people of unknown origin and uncertain history, who looked at the plagues and the pillar of fire and made the most consequential decision of their lives. Rahab made the same decision from inside a condemned city. Ruth the Moabite made it on a dusty road, choosing a widowed mother-in-law and an unfamiliar God over the comfort of her homeland. These were not exceptions to the covenant logic. They were its deepest expression. The chosen people was never a closed category. It was a covenant category. And a covenant, unlike a bloodline, can be entered. The conquest was designed to remove a specific corruption from a specific geography at a specific moment in history. But the door through which Rahab walked, with her scarlet cord still hanging in the window, was never locked behind her. Is the chosen people an exclusive club or an open invitation? The genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth, which includes Rahab and Ruth side by side with the patriarchs, answers that question without ambiguity. There is a strange and quietly devastating image in the wilderness narrative. Israel had complained against God, and serpents came among the camp, and people began to die. God's remedy was not the removal of the serpents. It was a bronze serpent, lifted on a pole, and the instruction was simply this: look at it and live. The thing that was killing them was the thing God used to heal them. The instrument of judgment became the instrument of salvation. You had to look directly at the source of your fear. The tabernacle carried a similar irony through every mile of the conquest. The God who commanded the destruction of the high places traveled in a tent of animal skins, no more permanent or imposing than the camp around it. The Ark of the Covenant, gold-covered acacia wood, carried on poles, contained the law that authorized the conquest, and it was borne on human shoulders, through the same dust the soldiers walked through. The God of the whirlwind chose to be portable, approachable, present in a tent, rather than enthroned in a temple. Every act of the conquest was, theologically, a forward shadow. Every city that fell, every altar dismantled, every piece of the harem carried out, was pointing toward a moment when the God who issued the decree would step inside it, when the judge would enter the dock. If God is the judge, who will judge the judge when he takes on human flesh? The answer was already written in the architecture of the tabernacle, in the smoke of the sacrifices, in the bronze serpent lifted in the desert. The answer was always coming. Golgotha was not a peaceful place. The Romans chose execution sites for their visibility and their message, and the message was the unambiguous language of empire. This is what happens to those who disturb the order. The cross was not a symbol when Jesus was nailed to it. It was a tool of terror, and the crowd that gathered was not a congregation. It was an audience for a punishment. And yet, in the theological accounting that the New Testament performs on that moment, something reversals itself with the force of a collapsing wall. The herem of Joshua, the decree of total devotion, of being utterly given over, consumed, surrendered to God, fell not on a city, not on a people, but on the Son of God himself. The darkness that covered the land for 3 hours was not meteorological drama. It was the sign of a cosmic reckoning, a holy war waged not against flesh and blood, but against death itself, against the serpent in the garden, against every Molech fire that had ever consumed an innocent. On the cross, God did not merely issue the sentence. He became the one under the ban. He placed himself under the decree he had written. The judge entered the judgment. What if the uncomfortable answer is that God killed himself to save his enemies? Not a metaphor, not a theological abstraction. A man bleeding in the dirt of a hill outside Jerusalem, bearing the full weight of the herem, so that the door Rahab walked through could be opened to everyone who had ever been on the wrong side of the wall. The disciples who walked with Jesus carried the sword of Joshua in their bones. They had grown up expecting a Messiah who would drive out the Romans the way Joshua had driven out the Canaanites, militarily, decisively, with God's army at his back. When Jesus told them to love their enemies, to turn the other cheek, to pray for those who persecuted them, he was not offering a softer, more evolved ethical system as a replacement. He was revealing the destination toward which the entire conquest narrative had always been traveling. The kingdom of heaven expands by a principle that overturns every military logic in history. The conqueror bleeds. The enemy is offered the scarlet cord. The walls come down not by force, but by the shout of a people who have learned to trust what they cannot see. Every empire in human history has grown by the blood of the conquered. Only one has grown exclusively by the blood of its king. Did the conquest fail so that the gospel could succeed? Not fail, complete. The conquest established that God is holy enough to act against evil, that his patience is not indifference, that covenant has weight and vows have consequence. And having established all of that in the dust of Canaan, God stepped into history to absorb the consequence himself. We return now to the courtroom where we began. The Old Testament is still on the docket. The charges have not been withdrawn, but something has shifted in the room, and perhaps in you, over the course of this journey through the evidence. The prosecution's case rests on a premise that seems obvious until you examine it, that a God who orders violence cannot simultaneously be a God of love. But justice without judgment is not justice. It is a wish, and mercy without truth is not mercy. It is sentiment dressed in the language of compassion. A God who looked at the Tophet fires of Canaan and felt nothing, who saw the iniquity accumulating across 4 centuries and remained comfortable, would not be a loving God. He would be an indifferent one, and indifference is not kindness. It is the most profound form of abandonment. The terrible beauty of the biblical God is precisely this. He is holy enough to hate evil with a hatred that acts, and he is loving enough to walk into the fire of his own judgment to pull his enemies out of it. These are not contradictions that need to be resolved. They are the two faces of the same inexhaustible character. Can you trust a God who isn't dangerous? A God without the capacity for judgment offers you nothing more than a sympathetic ear. The God of Joshua and the God of Calvary is the same God, and he is dangerous in exactly the way that a surgeon's scalpel is dangerous, precise, purposeful, and ultimately oriented toward life. The shofar is the oldest continuous sound in Jewish worship. It is made from a ram's horn, a reminder every time it sounds of the ram that appeared in the thicket on Mount Moriah when Abraham lifted the knife over his son. It is the sound of substitution, the sound of a life given so that another life could continue. It called Israel to assembly in the wilderness. It sounded 7 times around Jericho before the walls fell. It announced the year of Jubilee, when all debts were cancelled and all slaves went free. Shalom is the word we translate as peace, and we make it smaller every time we do. It does not mean the absence of conflict. It means wholeness, completeness. Every broken thing restored to the condition it was always meant to inhabit. It is not a feeling. It is a state of being that has been purchased always, at cost. The ram in the thicket, the scarlet cord, the darkness over Golgotha, the shofar fading into silence in a world that is still, in every corner, waiting for the wholeness it was promised. The fire has been burning throughout this documentary. You have seen it in the texts that made you uncomfortable, in the questions that did not resolve cleanly, in the God who refused to be manageable or small or safe in the way you may have preferred. The screen is going dark now, and the only question that remains is the only one that has ever truly mattered. Now that you have seen the fire, will you walk toward the light?